threatened them with arrest because they said you need to have a security guard license. They're not doing it for employment, they're doing it for free, and so that's not a legal requirement. But talk about how they stood down.
Yes, we saw right across the street immediately after the decision was announced, they were broadcasting it live via a radio system. And, people kind of freaked out, oh man, they had various reactions to it. And immediately somebody came across and threw a bottle and it busted out the windows of the Ferguson Fire Department, which is right next to the Ferguson Police Station. More than that, right across the street, they had various businesses, a cell phone store, a Boost Mobile store that got robbed, got looted. And it just shows you, and it's not even so much knocking the police, but everybody has this mentality that if it gets bad, I'll dial 911 and the police will come and save me. A building right across the street from the police department
got robbed. Not even 100
robbed.
yards.
Yeah. And of course, they could have done things preemptively. They were talking about how they had thousands of National Guard that were going to be there, and yet they pulled them back and didn't use them.
See, and that's what I didn't understand about Monday night. All right, we know the verdict's coming out. We knew that at 1 o'clock in the afternoon when him and I were sitting at the Clayton Justice Center, which is a little bit further south of Ferguson. And they're like, all right, we're going to release it at 4, then 5. And then we find out 8 o'clock Central Time. And I'm like, okay, you're going to do this at nighttime when we can't see what's really going on. This is a setup.
And more to that Biggs is talking about, they've been having those protests outside the police station regularly. And what time do the people get there? 8, 9 o'clock. So you're going to wait till you have the optimum amount of people out there in front of the police station. They also had more police officers and National Guard, and so, well, police at that point. But, you're going to wait till everybody is there and then release it. That was just, intentional.
Designed to fail.
Well,
they even had nighttime curfews because they knew that back in August when things
It was about 2 hours after the verdict, I would say, maybe an hour and a half when we went over to West Florissant. Hour and a half, 2 hours maybe. We get over there, and at this point, I remember, we were live, and I'm sitting here talking about how there were hundreds of SWAT police officers out there. When you say just tons.
Yeah, heavy armor,
everywhere,
MRAPs, all that stuff.
Meanwhile, a mile and a half away, you've got West Florissant Avenue burning to the ground. By the time we get out there, I counted 20 officers. That's it. You have fire trucks out there. There were way more firefighters on the ground trying to extinguish these fires to save businesses, and you didn't see any of these police officers help protect the firefighters or stand in front of the businesses. They all lined up at the road at the McDonald's and stayed away from where everything was going on. They
or
cowered.
they get in a line and get provocative, like getting in front of people's face and like, don't cross.
Oh, they were more worried about us walking behind them than they were about the people out there doing donuts in the road and shooting guns out the side of the window. I mean, one of those rounds could have hit one of those firefighters who was just simply trying to save a business in the community. And
so we see them getting very provocative with peaceful protesters, but totally standing down and leaving the area when there's any violent crime. That's
much like we saw in August. And they said, oh, we've learned from our mistakes in August. We've come up with a standard on how we're going to deal with the situation if it happens again. And quite frankly, I didn't see that on Monday. I praised a good bit of the way the police officers handled the week prior in some of the smaller protests. They weren't violent, really. They just kind of went after some people and they arrested 3 people a day or so. But Monday night, when the indictment or the non-indictment was out, just complete collapse.
Yeah,
it seemed like they didn't have any. I mean, here we are. There's 2,200 National Guard in the area.
Right up the road.
And they're
right up the road.
You know what they're guarding? Don Lemon, Fox News, CNN, all those guys. They're driving in little Humvees around.
The media area that's last time was the martial law command base. It's right up the street. But we walked there in real time. It took us, 3 minutes to get there from the McDonald's?
Well, let's talk about how we talked about how the timing of it was provocative, but even the fact that they didn't return an indictment, I believe, was provocative because they could have had a trial where people could have examined the evidence in public instead of having this secret trial. So people could have gradually digested what happened if they, in fact, had evidence that would clear the officer. That could have been done gradually, could have been done openly. Instead, what we got was a grand jury system, which is always done secretly and in private. They typically don't release any information about the grand jury's proceedings. They typically always intern an indictment. We've had in 2010, the most recent year that the government has released statistics, we had 162,000 grand juries convene. All of them, except 11, returned an indictment. essentially it's to say that we're going to look further at this. And if you've got a prosecutor, and the reason that happens is because in a grand jury, it is not a trial. I don't want to hear people saying we had a trial. We did not have a trial. In a trial, you have an adversarial relationship, you have a jury, you have a judge, you have transparency. We didn't have any of those things. We had a prosecutor who didn't want to prosecute. He was essentially the defense attorney. You would not have a defendant, if you're a legitimate lawyer, you would not have your defendant go before a jury and a prosecutor with no judge and the defending attorney not present for 4 hours to testify unless you knew going in that it was going to be, he was going to get softball questions or he was going to be let off. And now that we see these, they say, okay, we're going to make it transparent, which they typically don't do. I've called to check on indictments about people before, and if I can get through and talk to the district attorney, they will not tell me anything about the grand jury. They'll say, that's secret. It's not sealed and, can't release that and everything. But he's releasing the documents, but he released thousands of pages all at once. And so now you've got crowdsource operations going through, looking at what was discovered and what was not discovered, because it wasn't a prosecution, it was actually a vindication of Darren Wilson and a vindication of this prosecutor for not moving forward and having a trial. That's why he called the grand jury. He didn't need to have a grand jury. He could have indicted him himself, and he could still have indicted him. It was a way to clear himself, but it was also extremely provocative.
Oh yeah, and people were very skeptical about this even before it was announced. And people always ask the question, well, I wasn't there. I don't know what to say. But the thing about that is, I've dealt with a lot of police officers. I know you have as well, David, dealing with PIOs, trying to get the most basic of information. And I used to work at a jail. I read a lot of police reports, and I also talked to a lot of inmates. And then you have the person who says, I'm completely innocent, and you have the officer who says, this person is completely guilty. And the truth is usually someplace in the middle.
Yeah.
Maybe he's not as innocent as he wants you to believe, but he's also not, the devil himself, like the officer is trying to portray him to be. So, we have to make these mediums. And yes, a lot of the people who had the original testimony about what happened to Mike in the street that day, they changed their stories, and there's a lot of things that you don't know exactly what to believe. But, I think that can be possible for the police side as well.
Yes.
I don't think one side has...
But there wasn't any challenging.
Yeah, you don't really have any real opposition towards that story.
The way I saw the police handle stuff in August, when we went that first week, Jakari and Josh and I were there, I knew that he would not be indicted. Just the way they handled stuff, the way they covered up a lot of things, I had that feeling. I said it a few times, like, he will not be indicted. And I think most people who lived in that area felt the same way as well. The way they handled this, definitely not a speedy trial or, speedy. It wasn't taken care of fast in any way. It seemed like it was drawn out long on purpose, releasing the information at 8 o'clock at night. This all seemed like a giant setup from the get-go.
Well, again, remember, 2010, 162,000 federal cases, only 11 people were not indicted by a grand jury. But when you look at it from the perspective of the police, they said there's a recent Houston Chronicle investigation found that police have been nearly immune from criminal charges and shootings. In Harris County, grand juries haven't indicted a Houston police officer since 2004. In Dallas, grand juries have reviewed 81 shootings between 2008 and 2012 and returned only 1 indictment out of 81 of the shootings. So it's basically the other way around. So you got a 99.99% chance of getting indicted if you're not a policeman, but you've got like a 99% chance of getting off if you are a police officer.
And talking about these actions of the police officers, there's this image right behind us. I still want to know who this guy is. I want to know why this guy hasn't been in trouble, why he's aiming a gun at people inside of a crowd. Peaceful. I think this was the day they fired the tear gas, if I'm not mistaken.
That was the day they all rolled up down the street together.
Right after the police chief said there's no curfew, then they come out with the MRAPs, heavy armor, aiming guns at people in the crowd. Go home, you're going to be arrested. That sounds like a curfew to me. But these guys haven't faced any disciplinary action that I know of. Exactly. So if you're in the crowd, and I was speaking to an officer, this was off camera back in August, and then he said, well, we have to come out there and crack down because you have guys out here throwing bottles at the officers. I said, if you had 2 guys throw bottles at a county fair, you wouldn't tear gas the entire fair and start shooting people with rubber bullets.
Well, and of course they haven't done that when they have sports riots, which are just as bad in terms of buildings being torched, cars being
flipped over,
you have that type of thing because people are happy or they're upset about a sporting event. They don't come down with an iron fist.
What happens when you corner something? Anything. You have that urge to fight back. They cornered those people in that area, they were blocked off on both sides of the road. You had nowhere to go. And then you have these guys jumping out of the top with sniper rifles pointed at people. You know, when you're out there and you've got kids and grandparents around, you know, and you're a young guy and you see laser dots, you know, popping up on children and elderly, you're going to get angry.
Yeah.
They incited most of the violence every time. You know, when we were out there in front of the police station, most of the nights there was a lieutenant, I never got his name, handled the men really well. He kept them back, and they didn't use shields or anything like that. They just sat there in a regular uniform, hands in their pockets with like a winter coat. No incidences. Nothing happened. Some people would refuse to get out of the road, and they'd get arrested. But it would never lead to any kind of bad violence until that kind of stuff right there would happen. When they show up in all that equipment, and you're sitting there like, all right, we're out here protesting. Some people are refusing to get out of the road. That doesn't mean you should have a gun pointed at you. Every way they handled the situation was just completely wrong. They incited the violence. They wanted it. That's what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. This particular prosecutor has a long history as well. Since 2000, they've had 14 police shootings. They've only had convened a grand jury indictment 4 times. They haven't had any indictments. But going back even to 1992, because what he did in this trial is something he'd never done in his career before, and that is saying he's going to have a full trial with all the evidence. Typically, grand juries are a very short-term thing. It's a kind of a cursory next step to a full investigation, to a real trial. But going back, they took in this article from Mother Jones. They went all the way back to his history, to 1992. And in that situation, you had a man who was 62 killed, okay, white man. This is not a white against black. This is not somebody being singled out. This man was killed by a police officer who hit him with his car as he was chasing somebody else. Now, what this prosecutor said was, he said, well, yes, officers in pursuit need to use not just their lights, but their sirens. This officer did not have his sirens on. And he goes, but then that begs the question as to what is pursuit, because this only went on for 0.2 of a mile. So I don't think he was really in pursuit, so we're going to let him go. It's that kind of prevarication against something where they're not necessarily that this is premeditated, not necessarily this is something that was targeted, but it was misconduct. And they turn the other way and look the other distance, even on something like this. They basically give it a pass and prevaricate over the idea of what is legitimately pursuit or not. Clearly, he was pursuing the guy and not doing it in terms that he should have done.
Oh, yeah. We see this all too often, not just in Ferguson, but in many other cases as well. We talk about the situation that happened in Albuquerque. You know, they shoot a guy who's homeless. He's camping out in the woods or whatever. You know, he says, I'm going to walk down. Please don't shoot me. As soon as he walks down, flashbang grenades, guns go off, dog attacks him. They shoot him multiple times while he's on the ground. A situation like Kelly Thomas out there in California. You know, they beat the guy to death over the course of 20 minutes on camera. The cops get off.
A white guy, son of a police officer who taught, you know, and who was an instructor teaching people how to handle encounters like that. And yet the rules have changed from when he was a police officer to today. And that's the thing that is really concerning. But there's another part of this. And of course, we have a story that's up on INFOWARS.com, Darren Wilson and the Reality of Blue Privilege. And this is what the St. Louis County police detective who inaugurated the investigation said. He said, anytime I'm involved in an officer-involved shooting, fatal or otherwise, it's always during my initial investigation listed as an assault on law enforcement. Okay, Officer Wilson was the victim of the assault we were investigating. That's the presumption that he comes into with it. Okay, that he's exonerating a victim, and that's what we saw being presented. As if you look at the testimony within the grand jury, that's the way they presented it. That is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. And the thing I'm concerned about is how this has been spun racially to avoid addressing the real systemic issues that are here, that go to the training, that go to the union involvement, that go to the law enforcement Bill of Rights that Joe Biden put in after so many different attempts to give them a different treatment before the law. Go ahead.
And you're not even going to hear MSM, you know, Fox or CNN talk about stuff like that. You know, another way that they help fuel this entire racial thing, they go, Mike Brown, the 18-year-old kid, was killed by Darren Wilson, the white officer. They can't go, an 18-year-old man was fatally shot by an officer. They help fuel that racial war. And, you know, what it does is it gets people angry.
Yeah.
You know, and then it also it takes away the focus on what's really going on, like you said, the actual issue that's underlying there, the training, what's going on, or lack thereov, I should say.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, that's something that needs to be fixed. And that's another thing that makes me always feel like,